Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ, King of endless glory. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ, King of endless glory. From the shining cloud, the Father's voice is heard. This is my beloved Son, hear him. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ, King of endless glory.
The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus took Peter, James, and John, his brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. Behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, conversing with him. Then Peter said to Jesus in reply, Lord, it is good that we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. While he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud cast a shadow over them. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. When the disciples heard this, they fell prostrate and were very much afraid. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, Rise, and do not be afraid. And when the disciples raised their eyes, they saw no one else but Jesus alone. As they were coming down from the mountain, Jesus charged them, Do not tell the vision to anyone until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
I've been saying over the last couple months that 2023 is the year for positive change here at St. Bernard. So in light of that positive change, I'm realizing there are a couple of just some housekeeping announcements I need to make. It has come to my attention that a lot of people have been wondering about the group of altar servers here at Mass, the Knights of the Holy Temple that we have. People have been wondering why we have so many altar servers, et cetera, et cetera. And so I just want you to know I did write a bulletin article about that. If you miss it this week, it'll be in the bulletin again next week. Also, I've noticed that I think there's something that many of us in this parish are not familiar with, and it's understandable. I was not aware of this until I actually entered the seminary. But there is a rule in canon law that says that we are supposed to fast for an hour before receiving Holy Communion. We're not supposed to eat or drink anything unless it's a medicinal item that we have to eat or drink. And so I've noticed that some of us have been coming in to Mass with some drinks and leaving them out in the narthex or having gum and things like that. Again, this isn't a rebuke to anybody. I just want everybody to be aware. Right? The Church asks us to set aside an hour before receiving communion to fast from any food or drink, and that would include gum. And so just put that out there for everybody too, just so everybody can be aware. The reason why we do that is because we want to acknowledge the immense sacredness of Holy Communion. Right? And so I just ask everybody to remember that. Some of you who are old enough, you might remember the days where not only did you have to fast for an hour, you had to fast from midnight the night before. How many of you remember that? That was the rule before the Second Vatican Council. And canon law has become a little bit easier since then. But just a reminder about the hour fast. Okay, so just for anybody who is not aware of that. Likewise, along with a positive change at St. Bernard, we have said that this year is the year that we are going to become acquainted with the Bible. There are many Catholics who don't know or don't claim familiarity with the Bible. And as many of you know, this is even a reputation that many of us have among Christian denominations. People tend to know that Catholics, we don't know the Bible as well as some of the other Christian denominations. So this year is the year that is going to change. We've started already our small group Bible studies during the season of Lent. We have over 100 people signed up in Bible studies and about 15 different Bible studies going on. So very awesome, something to be very proud of. And something else that we are doing along these same lines is I'm going to spend the rest of the year journeying through the Bible with all of us. We're going to go over the major stories, the major characters, so that all of us will feel more familiar with the Bible. I'd even encourage you, if you want to, start bringing your Bible to Mass, and literally we'll read through some of the passages to the Bible together. Man, did the priest just say that? We have to bring our Bible to Mass? Yes. Okay. I think it is a great thing for all of us to get used to opening our Bible and reading through it together. So we're going to be doing that the rest of this year. But I mentioned last week that there were a couple of homilies I wanted to spend first just with some introductory thoughts about the Bible. Last week I talked about this whole supposed conflict between science and faith, between the God of the Bible and the God of science. And we talked about how so many of the most famous scientists in history were not only devout believers in God, but actually devout Catholics. Many of them were actually priests and nuns. There are over 30 craters on the moon named after Jesuit priests, right, who were the leading astronomers of their age. And we talked about some of the leading scientific discoveries in our modern age that even seem to be pointing to God. Most significantly, the theory of the Big Bang. Now we have, for the first time, it seemingly seems like we have scientific proof that the world was created. It had a beginning in time. Right? So we talked about some of those things last week, and what I wanted to talk about today is another objection that people have when it comes to reading the Scriptures. And maybe not an objection, but just a doubt, right? I know when I was growing up, I used to hear these stories about the Bible, and I thought, why did God perform so many miracles in the Bible, and yet he seems silent in my life, or he seems silent in our modern age? And I'm sure many of you have wondered this before, and it's tempting to think that maybe the Bible is just full of legends or myths. There's a couple of things we have to know about this. First of all, we need to know that miracles actually do still happen in the church. Just because it hasn't happened in your life doesn't mean it hasn't happened in the world. And I bet you that you probably know somebody who has experienced the miraculous. People tell me all the time, people tell priests things they don't tell anybody else because they bring them up in confession and spiritual direction. But I have people who tell me that they have had prophetic dreams. I've had people who told me that they can see spiritual realities, like angels, demons. There's a reason why every Catholic diocese has an exorcist, because these things really do still happen. Right? Or one famous example that I always point to as well is I always try to teach people about St. Padre Pio. St. Padre Pio is a very famous saint. He lived in the 1900s. He died in 1968. Okay? There's literally still people alive who knew him. Right? So first-hand witnesses. St. Padre Pio was known for his miracles. St. Padre Pio, even though he was Italian, he didn't know any other languages. People had come from all over the world to go to confession to him. And not only could he read their souls, right? He would actually tell them about things when they forgot to bring something up, right? So be thankful that I don't have that gift with you guys, okay? It'd be very intimidating to come to confession if that were the case. But he could read people's souls. He could also, even though he didn't speak any other languages, people would come to him from all over the world, and somehow they were able to communicate with him in their own language. St. Padre Pio also had the stigmata, which means that he had the wounds of Jesus in his body. It was most profusely whenever he would celebrate Mass. Because according to theology, we know that every time we have Mass, the priest acts as an alter Christus, or another Christ. Christ literally acts through him. That's why the bread and wine is changed, right? Because it is not the priest speaking anymore. It is Christ who is speaking. So when Padre Pio would have Mass, his hands would literally start to bleed profusely as he celebrated the Mass. St. Padre Pio could also be in two different places at one time. And again, there were many first-hand witnesses of this. There was even some testimony from first-hand fighter pilots during World War II who basically were flying over his city, preparing to bomb the location, and Padre Pio literally appeared in the sky and waved the pilot on. Right? Just amazing, miraculous stories. But again, this didn't happen in some distant age, right? That can't be investigated. There are literally still people alive who knew him, who witnessed these things. So miracles do still happen, whether you recognize it or not. And so therefore, we shouldn't be doubtful about these miracles in the Bible either. Another thing we need to know about the Bible is that the Bible is an extremely accurate historical document. So many of the stories in the Bible are stories of history. Sometimes we think of the Bible, and again, we think about it as just like a book of legends or myths, as like Star Wars in some distant age, right? In some unknown galaxy. It's not the case at all. All throughout the stories of the Bible, there are real historical persons who are mentioned. People for whom we know a lot about from extra-biblical sources, from other ancient historians, and even from archaeology. As a matter of fact, we have more evidence about the life of Jesus and about the early apostles than we have of any other ancient personage. So I'll give you an example. How many of you ever heard of Julius Caesar? Right? How many of you ever doubted whether Julius Caesar really existed or whether he really was the first Roman emperor? Probably none of you. Okay? Now, what you might not realize, though, is that we only have about 10 manuscripts about the life of Julius Caesar. Who's to say that somebody didn't just make the whole thing up? Compare that with what we have about Jesus. We have nearly 6,000 manuscripts about the life of Jesus and the early apostles. Compare 6,000 to 10. There's an overwhelming amount of historical documentation about the life of Jesus and the early apostles, and there's no major discrepancies in any of those manuscripts. As a matter of fact, those manuscripts we have, they're actually much older as well than the manuscripts we have about Julius Caesar. The ones about Julius Caesar date to about the year 1000 AD, over 1,000 years after he lived. Compare that to the New Testament. We have complete copies of the New Testament already in the 300s, just a couple of centuries after the life of Jesus. So there's an overwhelming amount of historical documentation about the life of Jesus. Something else that's really interesting is that the more archaeologists dig in the Holy Land, the more evidence they find for these different people in the New Testament. For example, they found a bunch of coins that say Poncio Pilato on them, right? Pontius Pilate. There's a stone believed to be a tomb of Pontius Pilate that they have found in the Holy Land. Right? Not only that, but many of the New Testament books, the ways that they describe Jesus, some of them are extremely accurate. Again, this is something really significant for us to know. Like, how many of you have ever read the Acts of the Apostles, like all the way through? Right? It's the 5th book of the New Testament, right? Not very many of us. But those of you who have read the Acts of the Apostles, you know that there's a lot of different people mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles. Because basically what happens in the Acts of the Apostles is St. Paul, right? I'm sure you're all familiar with St. Paul. St. Paul was preaching the gospel, and he was arrested for it. And St. Paul, because he was a Roman citizen, he was able to petition to the capital of Rome. And so there's a number of chapters in the Acts of the Apostles where basically St. Paul is going from city to city on his way to Rome, and he's being brought before different judges and governors. Okay? Now, what's interesting is that many historians have examined this, and they've examined all the historical data we have, and they marvel at just how accurate St. Luke describes all of these different persons, their titles, the years that they reigned. It's amazingly accurate. If the writer of Acts, which is St. Luke, was not a first-hand witness, there's no way he could have gotten all of these things right. Now, I have some, again, I told you guys I'm going to keep doing show and tell homilies. I'm really enjoying this recently. But just one example of one of these persons. Right? This is a statue of a man named Junius Gallio. Junius Gallio, right? I'm sure none of you have ever heard of him because he only reigned for 1 year in a small province called Achaia. He's mentioned in Acts of the Apostles, chapter 18. Now, what's kind of interesting about Junius Gallio is that scholars describe him as like the Jeb Bush of his day. Right? Why Jeb Bush? Because Jeb Bush, even though he was the governor of Florida, right, a presidential candidate, a pretty accomplished politician, right, he was always overshadowed by his dad and by his brother. Right? Now, the same thing happened with Junius Gallio. His father was a very famous Roman senator, and his brother was the famous philosopher whose name is Seneca, which I know we have some Wabash students with us. I bet they've read Seneca in their Wabash classes. So even though Junius Gallio, he was a Roman governor of this place of Achaia, he was always overshadowed by his father and his brother. Now, he's mentioned in Acts 18, he only ruled for 1 year. And it just so happens that St. Luke has all the information about him exactly right. His title, the place that he ruled, the year that it happened, right? If he wasn't a first-hand witness to this happening, there's no way he could have gotten that right. So there's a lot of things in the New Testament that are really surprisingly accurate that we have discovered. Something else I want to share with you about the New Testament is that when they do archaeological digs over in the Holy Land, it's kind of hard because people are still living there. So if you want to dig underground, you basically have to dig underground and build like platforms and bridges above ground for the cities to be maintained. So it's very hard to find things. And so in the 20th century, there were a lot of scholars, because there were a lot of things in the Bible that they didn't have any evidence of outside of the Bible, they began to question them. I actually experienced this when I was in seminary. My professors, they got their degrees back in like the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so they would share a lot of things like this with me. One of the things that they told me was when we were reading the Gospel of John, there's this story about the man who was lame, who was by the pool of Bethesda. Right? Oftentimes we actually hear this during the season of Lent. Now this pool of Bethesda, it says in the Gospel of John that it had 5 porticos. And you guys are like, okay, what's the big deal, right? I know. My professor, he said, you know what's really crazy about this story is that there's no way this could have really happened. Because in all the ancient pools, they never had 5 porticos. They never had 5 doors. They would have had 4 doors, and we've never found anything. Now, it just so happens that after my professor finished his graduate studies, right, they actually did discover this pool of Bethesda. And there's 4 doors on the corners, but what archaeologists didn't know is that there was a 5th door that acted kind of like a dam in the pool. Right? So literally, my seminary professor, he doubted that the Gospel of John was even written by the Apostle John, because he said, clearly all this stuff is made up. There's no way he could have been a first-hand witness. Well, the more we find in archaeology, we're actually finding more evidence of the things in the Gospel of John. It's a really amazing thing, and it's happening in archaeology today. Right, another example of that is, again, I don't want to pick on my seminary professor. Okay? Sometimes people go through graduate school and then they get caught up in teaching and they don't maintain the scholarly research. But there's other examples. He also told me that scholars don't really believe that King David really existed. How many of you remember King David, right, the man who battled Goliath, right, the most famous Israelite king? My seminary professor also told me that many scholars really don't even believe that David existed because there's nothing written about him outside of the Bible. Again, it just so happens that in the 1990s, there were actually 2 different ancient artifacts that were discovered that mention the kingdom of David. This is happening all over the place. And some of these things that they're finding are not just finding evidence of people in the Bible, but even some stories that seem like really hard to believe. Like some of the stories that seem the most legendary. Okay? Right? Can you tell? She's so excited, all right? This is awesome. She should be excited about this. So I just wanted to share with you guys a couple of other examples. There's this story in the book of Isaiah about this Assyrian emperor. You guys might remember the Assyrian Empire way back when you were in school in your world history class. You might have learned about the Empire of Assyria. Assyria was a very violent nation. And when they took over foreign peoples, right, they basically made an art out of torture, making an example to their subjects. Now, in the book of Isaiah, there's this really interesting story about one of the Assyrian emperors named Sennacherib. And in the book of Isaiah, it says that Sennacherib, basically he conquered all of the different cities of the Holy Land, and the only city he had left to conquer was Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the most famous city in the Holy Land, right? That's where the temple was. In the book of Isaiah, I'll never forget reading this for the first time. I was like, man, this is just crazy. What it says in the book of Isaiah is that Sennacherib had conquered all these other cities, and then he got to Jerusalem, and he had the city surrounded. And the king of Jerusalem was a man named Hezekiah. And the prophet Isaiah went to Hezekiah, and he said, King Hezekiah, do not be afraid. The Lord is with you. Go to the temple and beseech God's mercy upon the city. And according to the book of Isaiah, Hezekiah did this. And miraculously, a plague broke out in the Assyrian camp. And they went home. They never conquered the city. Again, I remember reading that and like, come on, seriously? A plague took over the Assyrian army? Well, it just so happens that we've actually found this ancient Assyrian cylinder, which chronicles the different military victories of the Emperor Sennacherib. And it's basically them boasting about all of their great military victories they had. Right? When you're writing ancient history, you tend to not write about your defeats, you just write about your big victories. And famously, it says that Sennacherib had Jerusalem surrounded. He had conquered all of the different cities, and he finally got to Jerusalem. It even says that he was asking for tribute from King Hezekiah, which is exactly the same amount that it says in the book of Isaiah. And Sennacherib wrote that he had Jerusalem surrounded and Hezekiah inside like a bird trapped in a cage. Right? Exactly what Isaiah says. And then all of a sudden, the story of the battle just ends. And all of a sudden, Sennacherib is back in Assyria. Never conquered Jerusalem. That's what this ancient Assyrian artifact says. Matches up perfectly with what it says in the Bible. Presumably, he didn't want to tell everybody in these later generations about how he and his army fled, because they only talk about their victories. But it's exactly what is recounted in the book of Isaiah. Right? Another really interesting story that is talked about. There's a man named Cyrus. Cyrus was a Medo-Persian emperor, also mentioned in the book of Isaiah. And what's kind of interesting in Isaiah and these ancient prophetical books is when Israel was taken over by foreign nations, usually they were not treated very kindly. Normally they were treated like slaves, right, in their own land. Oftentimes they're even taken to other areas in exile. Right? Now in Isaiah, it talks about this Medo-Persian king Cyrus, who, unlike all of those other pagan emperors, actually treated Israel as friends. He actually sent the people of Israel back to the Holy Land, and he actually gave them money to build their temple. And again, you read this in the Bible, you're like, man, this seems really out of character. Well, again, it just so happens, archaeologists have found something called the Cyrus Cylinder. And again, everything that is recounted in the Cyrus Cylinder just happens to match up exactly with how he is described in the book of Isaiah. Really crazy stuff. Now, this is the one I'll end on, right? This is the most fascinating one, in my opinion. How many of you ever heard of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah? Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Okay. Sodom and Gomorrah is this famous story from the book of Genesis, the very first book of the Bible, one of the oldest stories we have. And basically, because of the wickedness of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, God destroyed them, right? He rained down fire from heaven. This is where we get the famous phrase, fire and brimstone, right? It comes from the book of Genesis. It rained down from heaven. Again, this seems like one of the most legendary stories in the Bible. Like, there's no way this really happened. Again, archaeologists have been investigating. And there's a man from the United States. His name is Steve Collins. He's a very famous archaeologist. And he decided to try to find the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so he took all of the information that is laid out in the Bible about the location of the cities, and he and his team began to start digging. And they ended up finding a city that very much looked like it could have been Sodom or Gomorrah. They found a city that basically had a bunch of remains of ashes, right, in its remains, on the different skeletons that were there and some of the other different objects. And not only that, but he found a kind of mysterious substance on a bunch of the different pottery that was left over. It was like a glazy substance. And he was curious about it because it didn't look like anything he had ever seen before. It looked really out of place. And so he actually sent it to a lab back in New Mexico, and they told him it was a chemical called trinitite. Trinitite. Now, I bet you've probably never heard of the word trinitite. Trinitite is a very rare substance. The only time we've ever discovered it in another place was actually in New Mexico, after the United States was testing the atomic bomb. Basically, trinitite is something that forms when sand is heated to such a high temperature that it melts, and it becomes like a glassy substance. Steve Collins found this, not surrounding all the pottery, but only on one side of the pottery, literally as if it had come down from above. In order to make this kind of substance, you'd have to reach the temperature of 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It could only come from a heat blast. Whoa. Isn't that crazy? Oh my gosh. They literally were digging up where they believed the city of Sodom to be, and they found the remains of this city that had been destroyed by fire, some sort of heat blast, right? And they've even found signatures on some of the different writings there that perfectly match up with the time period that Abraham lived. Right? Abraham was alive when this happened, right? Just amazing. There's so many stories. I could tell you countless stories about different stories from the Bible that archaeologists and historians that just keep finding more and more evidence that these stories really did happen. And so I just want to bring that up to everybody this morning because, again, as we begin our journey, as we're going to start going through the Bible together, I don't want you to be left with all these doubts and skeptical ideas in your mind. Right? The Bible is a historical book. And the more that we try to study it and disprove it and investigate it, the more evidence we're finding for different characters and stories in the Bible, even ones that seem incredibly hard to believe, like the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. As I personally am very excited as we're beginning to go through this journey of the Bible together.